Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay, I think I'll just start with the next 5 minutes. Good evening, everyone.
We are live, ma'am.
All right. Thank you, Vajiri. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all for the guest lecture happening on Theorizing Gender and Violence. So, I have with me Dr. Amit Anand, who is working as an assistant professor at School of Legal Studies, Rewa University, Bangalore. He has further completed his PhD from Lancaster University, UK, and he has done his LLM from University of Readings, UK in 2050. He has also completed his BLLB honors from National Law School, Bangalore, and he has presented two oral statements to separate United Nations treaty bodies in the year 2021. The first statement was presented by Dr. Amit before the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the second statement was presented to the Committees on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. His joint submission on measures to prevent sexual abuse of children in the residential care homes in India to United Nations Committee on the Rights of Child, UNCRC, September 2021, has been cited by UNCRC in the Children Rights and Alternative Care. His interest lies basically in the international human rights. So we all know that, this violence against women is a very pressing issue in our society. And it's very essential for everybody to understand the theoretical framework of the problem that we are facing these days. So I hope this lecture is an opportunity for everybody us present here today, and I hope this session will be very informative with Dr. Amit Anand. So now I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Amit Anand. I'm sure this lecture will be very enlightening, thought-provoking, and informative. So without further ado, I would like to open the stage for Dr. Amit Anand. Over to you, Dr. Amit.
Oh, a very good evening to everyone present. Thank you, Tripti, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you to General Global Law School. Thank you to all for providing me with this opportunity to be here and speak about a part of my ongoing research on violence against women. So, although the topic is theorizing gender and violence, it's quite huge, and I don't think I'll be able to cover everything, but I'll try to keep it short, and hopefully there is something that we can discuss at the end of it. So, gender Theorizing gender and violence. Obviously, gender and violence, two important terms that are there to be discussed in this topic. So, gender-based violence and violence against women. These are two terms that are often used interchangeably, as most violence against women, we all know, in most societies is often inflicted by men for gender-based reasons, and gender-based violence tends to affect women disproportionately. Now, when I say this, I don't mean that young men, young boys, men don't are not facing gender-based violence. They do so, but we all know that women as a category are the most affected all over the world because of how gender is generally understood by most societies in the world. Violence against women, on the other hand, is an umbrella concept which centers the experiences of women as victims and survivors of violence. Gender-based violence is an umbrella concept which focuses on the meaning of violence rather than the identities of victims or perpetrators. So, irrespective of who is suffering or who is the one inflicting the suffering, the focus is on the meaning of violence. Now, despite its near universality around the world, local manifestations of gender based violence are highly variable. They depend on particular kinship structures, gender inequalities, and levels of violence in the wider society. They vary depending on how gender is defined and what resources are available to those who are battered. So, in terms, to put it simply, it's how the society thinks about gender roles and what expectations are there from those living in that society. And in terms of if somebody is being abused or being harassed, are there structures in place to provide the victim with justice? So all of this would tie into the understanding of gender violence, gender-based violence, and everything that falls into that particular category. Violence against women in the home, we all know, is shaped by patterns of marriage and the availability of divorce, by conceptions of male authority and female submission, and by the family's vulnerability to racism, poverty, or marginalization. For instance, the prevalence of sexual violence against women during armed conflict depends on ideas of militarized masculinity and the use of rape to dishonor enemies. So, this is something that's uh, although this particular instance about how women, young girls are often raped during armed conflict, this is not something new, but as an area of law, it's something that's now being researched heavily upon. So we all know the Russia-Ukraine war is going on. So questions about gender-based violence within the war context, it's something that certainly will come up before the International Criminal Court at some point or the other when that matter is taken up. Okay, violence between intimate partners also includes women's attacks on men as well, like I said in the beginning, as well as men on women. So, but we all know that conventionally the understanding of gender has been very uh, women-centric, and for rightfully and for right reasons, because we all know that women are women as a category are uh, often the ones who suffer violence a lot more than young boys and men. But that doesn't negate the fact that it also happens to young boys and men. And perhaps we don't know about all this because there isn't data available, there isn't research done, and uh, in some way, society is not in a position to accept that a woman could be a perpetrator and a man could be a victim. So gender-based violence or gender violence as violence whose meaning depends on the gender identities of the parties. Uh, it's generally an interpretation of violence through gender. So we need to understand that violence and gender they're two different concepts, and when we are trying to discuss them, we really need to be aware of in what social cultural context are we having that discussion. So not everyone who commits gender violence tries to justify it, of course, but when individuals do offer explanations of these incidents, they typically draw on ideas of gender and its responsibilities and entitlements. So, to take an example from our own country, I'm sure everyone knows about honor killing. So, whenever an incident of honor killing is reported, or whenever there is coverage on an incident of on a killing, you will always find the ones who have perpetrated the killing would offer justifications and for what they did and why they had to take up that measure. And uh, you wouldn't find any sense of guilt in their statements. They would rather be proud about the actions that they took. So, and that happens because the society entitles them, or there are certain entitlements that come with living in that particular social cultural environment that allows for honor-based abuse or honor killing to happen. And then society at large doesn't think that this is a criminal offense. Most of the people would come out in support of the perpetrators. So why does that happen? There is a lot that goes behind the scenes in terms of the understanding of gender and the understanding of how violence is often used as a tool in most patriarchal societies to commit violence. So men often use violence to establish power hierarchies, both against other men and through raping other men's wives. So it's not always men against women, but uh, a strong male person in the family could very well be exercising his masculinity in a manner uh, which might be detrimental to other men in that family setup who might not be in that stronger position to make decisions. So, in some ways, not just dominating women in the family, but also dominating other men. And that's something very central to understanding patriarchy. But that's something I'm not touching upon. It's rather a long conversation to that end. So with all of this in mind, and I'm sure there are a lot many angles through which we can talk about gender and violence, but what we need to keep in mind is the scope of gender and violence or gender-based violence is continually changing depending on mostly on the context in which we are going to have these discussions. So in a society that's liberal, that's modern, that thinks a lot about human rights, and you are free to speak about human rights violations. So in such societies, perhaps discussions on gender violence would not be restricted, or it might take different dimensions compared to a society uh, which is rather conservative in its thinking. So although we could talk a lot about gender violence, there isn't actually uh, a universal explanation for gender violence. Or I would also say that there isn't some sort of an definition as such, which we could all hold on to and try and understand. But with research and with time, the understanding of this very wide concept has reached everyone around the globe. So, but it's always best to understand gender violence in terms of the wide variety of particular contexts that shape its frequency and nature. So, gender, people who fail to conform to normative expectations of male or female appearance or behavior often face high levels of violence and murder. And that's your very simple understanding of what this means. Now, the term transgender, it refers to people whose gender identity or expression obviously does not conform to the social expectations for their assigned sex at birth. People who fail to conform to heterosexual male and female identities face gender policing in the form of harassment and violence. This violence, often delivered randomly by strangers, is nothing but a mechanism for enforcing what has been called a heteronormative binary system. This refers to the requirement that all humans fit into a binary that is male and female and heterosexual arrangement of gender identity. And that binary is considered to be the norm, and anyone who is outside that isn't necessarily part of the society. So those who fail to conform face a variety of forms of violence. So even if you are part of the binary, even if you fall into the category of female, but you don't necessarily show uh, characteristics of a female, and by that I mean you don't necessarily show
Dr. Amit, can you hear me? I think there is some network issue. He's back with us.
All right. So I was making the point about binary heteronormative binary system, and why that's something at the core of understanding gender-based violence. Now, instead of referring to sex roles, anthropologists adopt the concept of binary heteronormative binary system, where gender is defined as the assignment of roles based on biological biological sex.
I think there is a bad network at the side of Dr. Amit. I think he'll be back shortly.
Difference that we need to keep in mind. Now, in my research, when I was looking into issues of gender and violence, I came across the work of Judith Butler, specifically Gender Trouble, which came out in 1990. And what she talks about is a performative perspective of understanding gender and violence. So, from a performative perspective, doing violence is a way of doing gender. So, in some situations and contexts, the performance of gender identities mean acquiescing to violence or being violent. So, by putting up with violent assaults without complaint, minimizing the violence, calling it deserved, or treating it as inevitable, women do gender, which means that they are in some ways accepting the expectations that the larger society has. So by not revolting or by not questioning why they are being abused or harassed, in some ways they are contributing to the cycle of violence. And this is what Judith is talking about. So when men batter women, they are performing masculinity, not only for the women, but also for other men who assess their masculinity by the performance. So it's also true for the other sex here. So when men beat up women, in some ways they are also doing gender. And by that I mean that they are in some ways performing their masculinity. They are proving to the outside world that yes, they are men. And if they don't do that, then their masculinity gets questioned in society, which no man likes. So this is nothing. This is, I mean, obviously I'm putting it very simply, but Judith Butler's, very simply, this is the understanding of performance of gender, uh, which both men and women either they do it on their own or there are external pressures which force them to do this. Now, though most societies in modern times remain largely patriarchal, they are often identified through social, political, economic status of their women. Now, often recognized as the silent half of humanity, women and their treatment in patriarchal societies provides us an opportunity to engage in discussions about the other, which is women, and question the power hierarchy which places women at the margins in a male dominated world. So, when we talk about performance of gender, we obviously are talking about a category of sex that's for a very long period of time across the world in most societies has been subjugated. So, this gives an opportunity to talk about the victim and the victim's perspective and try and understand what they go through. Now, there is this other feminist, Simone de Beauvoir, whose work I cited in my research. So, in her work, which is called The Second Sex, she provides a feminist perspective to the understanding of gender by challenging the belief in the natural causes for the difference between men and women. So, she says it's not because of how biologically we are made, it's something else. It's part of identity politics that we are struggling with this whole issue. So she argues that the very idea of a woman is a male concept and that what it means to be a woman is defined by men. Further, it is society that also accords meaning, which is mostly negative, to female experiences such as development of female sex organs, menstruation, pregnancy, menopause, and considers these experiences as a burden and disadvantage. So and obviously, Judith Butler also agrees with Beauvoir's claim that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So now I'll just like very quickly read an excerpt from Butler's understanding of Beauvoir's claim, and this is something which will actually put the entire thing into context. So just bear with me. So Butler says that if there is something right in Beauvoir's claim that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, it follows that woman itself is a term in process, a becoming, a constructing that cannot rightfully be said to originate or to end. As an ongoing discursive practice, it is open to intervention and resignification. Even when gender seems to congeal into the most reified forms, the congealing is itself an insistent and insidious practice, sustained and regulated by various social means. It is for Beauvoir never possible finally to become a woman, as if there were a telos that governs the process of acculturations and construction. So, what essentially she is trying to say in all these complex terms is that it's the society that tells a young girl that she is a girl, or a young woman that she is a woman, and the manner in which the society tells it, it's it obviously isn't that good. So, by harassing a young girl, or by harassing a young woman at a workplace, or by catcalling, or by abusing or beating her up, it tries to tell the woman that she fits into this category that's always going to be dominated upon by men. So, whatever bodily changes or whatever changes as in terms of personality or otherwise that she's going through is shaping her ultimately to become something that's always going to be dominated upon. So this whole idea of gender is a process, and it's a process that ultimately
I think there is a very bad network at the side of Dr. Amit. I think he'll be back shortly. Please bear with us.
is it that it is doing the choosing, and what if anything determines that choice. So it's about understanding where who you are and where you are placed in that society. So if you just start with these two questions about who you are and where you are placed in a particular society, I guess the understanding of gender and violence would really become clear. Now, when we come to violence, with this very basic understanding of gender, uh, we understand that violence isn't just always physical, but it's also emotional and has psychological dimensions as well. For a very long period of time, violence has been
Dr. Amit, can you?
emotional trauma, pain, psychological dimensions, and all of that. So, violence is a fundamentally a cultural construct. The social and cultural dimensions of violence are what gives violence its power and meaning. So, now in order to better understand the existence of systematic nature of discrimination against women that often results in violent acts and practices which endangers their life and liberty, I will very quickly sum up the discussion by focusing on two concepts. One's legal pluralism and the other is intersectionality. Now, there are other concepts, other theories through which you can understand gender and violence, but I feel, especially in the Indian context, if we have to talk about legal pluralism and intersectionality, without which I don't think we can really have a discussion, a good discussion on gender and violence. So, legal pluralism as a concept has been applied across various disciplines, not just law, but mostly in sociology. However, for the purposes of socio-legal scholarship, which when you take up a research with that mindset, obviously you come across legal pluralism. Legal pluralism can be understood as a scenario in which two or more legal systems coexist at the same time. It is also possible that these legal systems exist and act independent of each other, which obviously is very true in the Indian context. We have the formal law on one hand, and then social reality that is governed by different factors uh, of caste, religion, You have family, you have traditions, you have culture, uh, how a community believes they should be governed by. So there are different categories of things that are on one side, and on the other side you have formal law. So you have the constitution, you have your legislations, and all that comes with it. So there is this existence of two systems in one given uh, environment, and how they interact with each other. What's the level of friction? Is one dominating over the other? So all these questions can be understood if we talk about legal pluralism and try and understand gender and violence from that very perspective. So legal pluralism as a concept, it underlines the fluid nature of law, and that how in practice its meaning is understood differently by different societies and different sections of the societies. So today the concept of legal pluralism is also better understood via the debate regarding the relationship of legal pluralism and human rights law, and what meaning human rights law acquires when it interacts with more than one set of laws in a particular social system. So now, obviously, with formal law, if you go to formal law and try and understand human rights, then everything would appear to be great and good, because formal law mostly is structured around ideas of freedom, liberty, all of that, which human rights is based on. But when you take human rights to the other spectrum, to the other end of the spectrum, and take it to society, then perhaps you will get questions that that they don't understand. That people who you talk to, or if you talk to the larger society, their understanding of human rights might be different to the formal law understanding of human rights. And that's what I'm trying to say, that even if you talk to victims, they might not be able to understand what situation they are in, or whatever is happening to them is a violation of their human rights, because there are different factors that often shape their thinking. And it might be possible that they are not aware of what's happening to them. So this complex relationship between legal pluralism and human rights uh, needs to be highlighted as one of the main reasons behind failure of contemporary understanding of human rights and human rights initiatives in most part of the world. So we know that we have the constitution, and outside India there are very many conventions, treaties at the international level, which have been talking about rights of women for a very long period of time. But when it comes to their domestic implementation, they really don't work on the ground. And a major reason behind that is the failure to understand that there are multiple systems existing in a given setup, and we really need to understand how far the law can permeate and really reach on the ground, and try to then make sure that the international understanding of human rights is actually applicable on the ground. So it is believed that human rights activism has only focused on the formal legal system of states, rather than ensuring how justice is delivered to individuals placed at the bottom of society, who are often governed by separate local systems altogether. So there are a lot many things that complicates an individual's life, and especially the ones that are often said to be vulnerable or marginalized in a conservative society. And within that category, you have young children, you have women, you have older people, you have disabled people. So all these group of people uh, who who go through what they go through because of the social setup that they live in has to be acknowledged in order for the law, which mostly at the international level, for a very long period of time had to do with state-to-state interaction, and very recently it has opened up to individuals and their concerns. So for that formal setup, for that formal law to really understand social reality of marginalized and vulnerable people, it really is a very big challenge. So the complex relationship between legal pluralism and human rights, especially in relation to women's rights, is related to a lack of consideration of the manner in which women negotiate their claims to justice, keeping in mind their social position and overall social setup. And this is not just true for women, but obviously it's true for young kids, young men, young boys, older people, disabled people as well. So in most cases, state laws or formal laws that protect women, you will find that they are often in direct conflict with non-state laws, which are based on community practices, uh, which are rooted in patriarchal traditions. So, however, they simultaneously coexist and overlap, with the latter generally being viewed as more accessible and familiar. So, in short, non state laws based on community beliefs and norms often eclipse formal state laws in terms of influencing the decision making processes of women who try to seek justice. Now, the framework of legal pluralism is also important for gender based studies because it allows for discussions on issues such as gender norms, social beliefs that surround a woman's reality, mostly in the developing world. But despite existing redressal mechanisms, which are mostly formal in nature, and by that I mean the police, the court, the justice system, women suffering from human rights violations often do not make use of such systems, nor do they find support from within the society to seek justice from such systems. Women neither file complaints nor directly approach any judicial authority. This is because of, again, like I said before, varied reasons such as lack of knowledge that there is a system or there is help out there, ignorance of their human rights, fear. It could also be financial problems, lack of trust in the functioning of formal institutions like police and courts. So, women in general, as well as women belonging to marginalized communities, they tend to show this disbelief in formal legal institutions, mostly due to social cultural reasons. They are made to believe that making use of state run institutions to seek justice will only do them more harm than good. Again, these formal institutions themselves are not free from biases, including those of caste, class, religion, and gender. So they have problems of their own, which further complicates the matter for women. So therefore, most cases pertaining to human rights violation, uh, they are settled indoors or within the community. And when that happens, obviously the ideas and the beliefs of the community govern a given incident, and there is very less of law, or there is very less of legal reasoning that's present. So you can obviously understand that in terms of justice to the victim, whatever decision community leaders or the family comes to wouldn't really be justice and wouldn't really be safeguarding the rights of the victim. So with all these complexities existing in society, especially societies that are diverse, that have very many different religions, and people are categorized in that society based on who they are, where they're from, what language they speak. So with all these gradations, it's very difficult for formal state law to really beat non-state law, especially in upholding human rights on the ground. So there is this friction, a lot of friction that happens, and you will also find that in societies, in at least some societies wherein the society dictates the law, so you will obviously find weaker laws present there, and there wouldn't be any scope for a real justice for the victims because the law is made weak because society and societal beliefs overpower or reinforce their dominant position on the understanding of law and the understanding of human rights. So there ideally wouldn't be much of a discussion on human rights in such societies. The final thing before I end is I want to talk about intersectionality. Now, whatever I've said, intersectionality is the answer for that. It's basically taking everything together and trying and understanding uh, how many factors are present for us to really think of a solution to gender-based violence or violence against women. So intersectionality in some ways is a helpful tool. Now, intersectionality as a concept started off in the late 80s in the US, and this was basically first centered around the problems of African Americans in the US, and it was actually Kimberly Crenshaw who coined this term in 1989, and her understanding of intersectionality was about understanding identity politics of not only African Americans, but also of other minority communities, especially with respect to violence against women. But later on, this particular concept has been taken forward and has been applied in several other scenarios. So, uh, if you look at literature on violence against women, recent literature that's available, you will find Indian authors and scholars and researchers uh, taking help of intersectionality to understand problems in the society. So it's nothing but an alternative method of understanding uh, the problems in society and how far intersectionality could be a tool in reaching a solution. So it's often believed that the concept of intersectionality it challenges conventional thinking in new areas and will often lead to better engagement of thought about how inequalities based upon race, gender, class, etc., intermingle and are then used as a tool of oppression. So, for instance, in the Indian context, wherein despite an increase in the usage of intersectionality recently, to understand patterns of discrimination and deprivation in society, the correlation between caste and gender is still not acknowledged as part of human rights discourse. For instance, regardless of several cases of violence against Dalit women by dominant caste groups, the overall situation of Dalit women in India has not received the required attention from the state machinery. Now, despite studies revealing that Dalit women suffer from gender bias, caste discrimination, and economic deprivation at the same time, there has been no comprehensive effort made to understand the intersectional issues of caste and gender. So in majority of cases, you find Dalit women face more violence than Dalit men because of the belief that by targeting Dalit women, dominant caste groups can bring down their honor of Dalit men. Further, apart from facing sexual violence, Dalit women also suffer in almost every other aspect of their life due to caste, gender, intersectionality. So with this, I'll just wind up uh, whatever I have to say on theorizing gender and violence. That it's not something that we can really easily grasp. I mean, especially in societies like ours, uh, where there are a lot many ways to understanding. Obviously, that's a good thing. I would say that there are these different perspectives existing that help us to understand gender violence, uh, given the setup that we are living in. But it also poses as a challenge to some extent because of so many things that exist out there that are mostly against the understanding of human rights or against the understanding of law or the ideals in the constitution. So there are a lot many factors that play into uh, the general understanding of violence against women or just understanding what is gender and why violence is often used as a tool to uh, by the larger society to make everyone realize that they need to perform certain specific tasks depending on the gender that they have been that they are placed into and why that's important. So essentially what I want to say is that we need to be mindful of the social cultural pressures that exist around us. uh, we need to be mindful because these are problems, these are challenges that if we don't talk about, we'll not be able to find solutions for them. And that's why we see laws on so many things failing to actually do what they're supposed to. So, and then the prime example of that is uh, penal legislations on protecting rights of women. We obviously have the harshest of punishments under our penal law against offenses committed against women, and so we have punishments for that. But that in itself hasn't really brought down the crime rate, and we really need to think, stop and think as to why that is. So, trying and understanding gender and gender divide, and why is it that we are not comfortable in talking about the one who has suffered uh, or rather made to suffer is important. And concepts like intersectionality, legal pluralism, and there are several other out there, really help us to uh, to in some ways restart the discussion on protecting rights of women and obviously those who are vulnerable or marginalized. So that's all that I had to say on this. Obviously, this is something that I could speak quite a lot about, and obviously, I'm sure that a lot many people who are present here know quite a lot about this. But this was just my side of things and how far I have understood this particular topic. So yeah, that's all from me. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amit. So, I'm just glad we have you on, this platform right now, with everybody. So, I'm just like, I just have one thing in mind, thank you for throwing light on the concept of legal pluralism. And when you talk about intersectionality, when we talk about gender-based violence. So, Dr. Anand, in your opinion, what do you actually think, when we talked about our society and cultural norms? That actually perpetuates the violence against women, and how can we begin to bring a shift in these sort of attitudes when we talked about gender based violence? Like, what do you think?
So obviously, where we are placed currently in the society in terms of we often read and hear about news in the news about violence against women and how the crime rate against women is not slowing down, but it's rather increasing. And most of us, after the Delhi gang rape, really did think that society is going to take a turn and things would be better for young girls and women. Irrespective of where they are, whether they are in the metropolitan cities or in rural areas. But it actually didn't amount to anything. I mean, obviously, there were changes in the law which nobody is denying that it was the need of the hour and it's important. But in some ways, the effort to eradicate or prevent gender-based violence and inequality between genders, that particular movement, it didn't actually reach its destination. So it kind of got stuck after the 2012 gang rape, and uh, we restricted ourselves to just, in some ways, enhancing the law, but not really thinking on why such crimes were committed or why they continue to be committed. So trying and understanding. And now this is something that in law school setup, obviously students get to learn about the law, about human rights, about gender rights and all of that. But what's needed is that whatever knowledge they acquire, they're also supposed to be critical about it. So they are supposed to be asking questions as to why the things are that the way they are. And uh, if you move out of law school, then obviously you need to educate others about what you have learned. And this is not just true about law schools because we are closer to the law than anybody else, but even in disciplines that have nothing to do with law, even they need to, at least from an educational perspective. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the societal level. But as people who are involved in research and education, this is something that we could at least start doing. That in terms of understanding what is gender-based violence and starting to talk about it. So law students obviously are better placed than anybody else to try and understand this because we understand the law a lot better. Sociologists, the students who are taking up sociology, also are better placed in some ways, but it's important to then spread the word about these things. And if it comes from people like us, people who in some ways are uh, more closer to these things than the others, then I guess it will really change things because yeah, I mean, those who understand the law, those who understand social behavior, at least if they start talking about it, then obviously it reaches a lot of people and with authority, obviously, as well. So we are not just talking about things in the air. We obviously know the law and what social atmosphere it is. So in that way, I guess it really would make sense if that dialogue happens, especially in academic circles, and then try and engage with the outside world as well, which is more important. It's not just to have discussions like this within ourselves, but it's also important to then engage with other communities. So law schools could probably take up could join in with their local police authorities and maybe do a session on understanding violence and how, in some way, sensitize them about how to handle victims who have gone through no offenses which are sexual in nature, and obviously specifically related to young girls and women. So that could be one possible way. There are different ways. There are different ways to look at gender and violence, and whichever way you look at it, it will give you a different solution and what needs to be done. And there could be different ways. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Amit. Also, I just would like to ask one thing, like, do you have any advice, like if the young law students or a young professional who actually wants to pursue the career in the same field, so how they should go about it?
In terms of pursuing career, I'm not sure I can tell something concrete because I don't think I have that kind of knowledge. But uh, especially as a law student, if you are in your early years in the law school, then uh, if you want to build your knowledge in this, then perhaps look for opportunities where you can learn about these things. So if there is a course in your law school, maybe take that up. If it's something that's optional, then, and if you're interested in it, maybe you take it up and try and build your own knowledge around it. uh, Discussions like these, conferences on women's rights, that's a nice opportunity to meet other people, to build connections, to let other people know what you think. uh, but in terms of having a career in this, obviously a lot of it is very research focused. If you can get hold of a prominent NGO that's working in the area of protecting women's rights, so that might be a possible uh, start to then move forward. An internship in an NGO that's women centric, that's known, that could really help. Obviously, look at the UN websites, and they regularly put out information on things that they are doing, and perhaps if it is something that you feel that you could contribute on, then go ahead and contribute. Uh, you could, if there is nothing on women's right in your law school, then you could push for something like this. You could ask your professors, have a discussion with them to start a course, or call people. uh, you could bring in people who have worked in this area. They could be bureaucrats, they could be activists, they could be researchers, they could be people known internationally, and get them to engage and work on projects that could enhance the understanding of gender-based violence domestically as well as internationally. So there are different ways, but uh, yeah, so it's up to anyone who wants to take up whichever the way they want to take it up, and so yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amit. So now I would leave the floor open for discussions from the audience. If anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself and you can just put it forth. Or even you can write in the chat box. If anyone has any question. All right.
Hi, Tripti.
Hi, Aparna.
Yes. Hi, I have a question.
All right.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Amit. It was a very insightful discussion on gender and violence. My question is related to the international conventions or the agreements. We have different conventions, the CEDAW, or even the UN Declaration on Elimination of Women Violence Against Women. So your discourse was mostly revolving around women in general, right? So I wanted to know whether these conventions are, addressing this issue of gender-based violence, or is it something in an appropriate way or a systematic way, or is it lacking in somewhere? Because still, in spite of a lot of research, we are still talking about the same things again and again. So what do you think? How can the international agreements or international scenario influence this topic? How does it influence this topic, or is there any action taken, or do you think the action taken by the international, internationally, is it sufficient or is it lacking somewhere? That's my question.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. And to be honest, it's not working internationally. Now, despite conventions, despite the UN trying to do a lot to acknowledge problems of women for a very long period of time, uh, all they have done, obviously, there is acknowledgement at the UN level, and that really resonates with the rest of the world. But in terms of actually doing something, I guess CEDAW and the Declaration on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, as you rightly mentioned, these were two prominent steps that the UN took. And now, obviously, it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge violence against women, different kinds of violence. So the understanding at the UN level is that violence against women isn't just physical. It obviously takes into account a lot many different factors as well. So that was a good step. Uh, Violence against women, the UN said that it's also inclusive of gender-based violence. So that again was a very good step. Within the CEDAW, you have the Committee on CEDAW that's tasked with its implementation. And what it does is that obviously India has signed and ratified the CEDAW Convention. So it's obligated to provide information on whatever the committee might ask. So the committee could question India's performance domestically in terms of protecting rights of women. And it has, in the past, asked questions on how far India has been successful in protecting victims of honor-based abuse or witchcraft or similar other forms of violence that often target uh, women. But India hasn't been forthcoming in terms of providing an answer at the international level. Now, the Committee on CEDAW obviously can ask these questions a lot, and they do ask, but in terms of making sure that the principles of the conventions are actually implemented on the ground. If you're taking India as an example, the committee can't really do much. It's more about pressurizing the state, and just putting the information out in the world that the performance of the Indian state is not that good in terms of protecting rights of women. So if you actually want things to get done, obviously at the international level, uh, hands are tied in terms of what the committee members can do. But it's more about naming and shaming, and that's how international law is. It's you can't really pressurize somebody, but what you can do is just build that sort of international pressure. And when questions are asked by the UN, and there are other countries who jump in and ask questions that why the Indian state is not doing it, that I guess somewhere it really then trickles down and makes the lawmakers or the policymakers think that where they have gone wrong. And even if that doesn't work, you have the Indian judiciary, which has been obviously known for its liberal approach for a very long period of time and has protected human rights, not just of women, but everyone, where the state has failed. So things are complicated at the UN, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It's important that at the international level there is acknowledgement of every form of violence and everything that's out there. Because if there is no acknowledgement, then I guess we are not in a position to talk about solutions or talk about how to further strengthen existing structures. So yeah, that's all I can say on the international side of things. But yeah, there is some work done, but hopefully a lot gets done and faster, which is very much important.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. Do anyone else has any question? Please go ahead.
This is Hakim, and I want to thank Dr. Amit for the intellectually sound and engaging analysis on gender-based violence. Yeah, so listening to you, there's this issues that came to my mind. One is about the issue of aggression. Do you think men are naturally wired or have the high proclivity to resort to aggression to address their feeling? And that might be one of the contributing factors to gender-based violence, especially against women. The other is to look at violence in terms of action and reaction. Do you think if there's physical violence, it may be a reaction to some psychological violence, committed in the first place? And how do we know that? Try to understand who suffers violence most, because men, to some extent, may be very quiet or not want to open up on some of the violence they may go through in society because of how society is a cultural construct, and maybe how men want to use that to maintain their dominance in society. So looking at anger management as an option, do you think that could also be used as a tool to try to see how gender-based violence can be reduced by just adopting anger management as a way? Because if due to anger, men unleash violence on women, it might not be because they are women, but it's just that they have anger management problem. And so that could be another way of looking at it. And also the issue of empirical data. Do you think we need a more interdisciplinary approach to understanding gender-based violence? Because lawyers might be focusing on who suffered injury and what are the remedies. How about sociologists? Are they looking at how this happened? Why is it that we are not able to stop it despite the rich history and conversation about gender-based violence, yet we still have this problem up to today? And so these are things that just pop up in my mind, and I want to bring that up for discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for raising these issues. Now, you did ask about, do I think if all men are aggressive and they are naturally prone to oppress women? So I don't think that's. I wouldn't say that that's true, because in some ways, if I agree to that statement, I'll be placing all men, irrespective of what they think or who they are, into one box, and in some ways stereotyping them just because they are men. So just because you are born as a man, you're supposed to be strong, you're supposed to be rude, you're supposed to be have some controlling nature, and you should then naturally oppress women. But I don't think that's true, and this is wherein also the problem of understanding, or rather not understanding, that men can also be victims of gender-based violence. So it might be a possibility that a married couple, uh, in this case, if I'm taking the example of a man and a woman, so it might be possible that the woman might be more dominating than the man. It doesn't have to do with the physical attributes or the physical buildup of either of them. So the man could still be strong or like tall, and the woman might not be strong in terms of her appearance, but she could still very much be dominating, and the husband wouldn't have any option but to listen to her. So if you're just sticking to the physical characteristics, then I think that's in some ways we are doing injustice, and we are ourselves trying to push away the fact that even men can be victims and women can be perpetrators. So that's something that there is research on this, quite a lot that's done recently in different geographical contexts. I'm not sure if there is enough in the Indian side, but that's one thing. Another thing that you talked about is anger management. I wouldn't necessarily say that all violence against women is because men got angry and they just beat up women, or they raped women because they were angry. It's because of the fact that they feel entitled to do so. They feel that it's a normal thing to do. The whichever way they react, it could be just harassment, not of a very higher level. It could not involve any physical injury, but the fact that they feel that it's okay to do is somewhere more deeper than just anger issues. I mean, if you are angry, and if you just talk about anger problems or psychological problems, then it it's a different thing altogether. Then perhaps you need medical help and you need some sort of psychiatric care. But not all men who commit these forms of violence have a psychological problem. So they could be very rational, they could be educated, they could be holding high positions, uh, they would be aware of the law, but they still choose to do it, and they think that they can get away with it, and they feel that it's okay to do these things, and maybe they can then force the victim to stay quiet or not file a case or just forget about whatever happened. So the fact that they are able to think this way or they are able to do all these things, this is coming from somewhere else. It's not coming from anger or psychological problems. So but who knows, maybe there is a side to this, and like you said, there needs to be data and research on different aspects of gender-based violence. And the more we talk about these things, the more we get to know about stuff that we are missing out, and maybe we should focus on them. And if we focus on everything, then I guess we'll be able to reach a solution much faster than we hope for. Uh, so I hope I answered your question in some way.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. We'll just take one last question for the day, that is by Sabina. The question says, could you please share your thoughts on gender budgeting? How effective do you think this initiative would be, handle women and children vulnerabilities during disaster?
Okay, so this, I mean, the thing that comes to my mind is if you're talking about disasters, then climate change is something that we can take as an example. And why we don't talk about how women are more affected during climate change than men. So because they have more responsibilities than men. So whenever there is a climatic disaster or something, there could be a flood, a cyclone, an earthquake, all of that. So you have men in the area quickly migrating to different parts of the state or the country to look for work, leaving behind their wives, daughters, sisters to take care of the home. And keep in mind that they are still in that affected area. So it's not that when there is a cyclone or a flood or a disaster of any other kind, that help reaches to everyone quick enough. It takes months for the state administration to really get things back on track. And during that time, uh, young girls, women, older people, they have to be living in that scenario, and they can't move out from there because of problems. There could be problems about things like they have a home there, they have their entire life set up there, so they can't just pack up things and move with the menfolk. They are not able to do so because they might be having land that they have to take care of, and perhaps the society doesn't allow for women or girls looking for work because they obviously say that it's the job of the men to look for work, and women are supposed to stay back and look after the family. So if you are talking about doing something for victims uh, who have been affected by climate change or disasters, then in terms of raising funds, in terms of budgeting, you should also focus on different categories of victims. So I'm not saying that men are not victims. Obviously, they are victims. They have lost their jobs. They have lost means of livelihood. So you take care of them, but you also set aside some amount for victims whom we often ignore or who are often invisible to us. So older people, young girls, their schools might have been destroyed because of the flood or the earthquake, and so where will they get immediate education and things like that. So there could be several things, and you need to really think about every section of the society in terms of, when you talk about relief, you talk about compensation, about rebuilding life. So you have to think about everyone's life that got affected, and you really need to do something about that. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. Thank you, Aparna, Sabina, and Professor Hakim for just highlighting all those issues and bringing up a wonderful questions and widening our eyes on international conventions. Quickly, I'll just have one thought to put forth for Dr. Amit. When we talk about gender-based violence, Dr. Amit, how do you elaborate? Like, we have certain notions on, gender roles and these stereotypes that they're contributing toward gender-based, violence. So how can we tackle these, or, how can we bring change in these ideas? So what do you think when we talk about suffering, we talk about pain, actually? So how can you just elaborate and inculcate all those mix up into one thought that we can just put forth?
All right. So in terms of getting people to talk about these things, it's important to hear victim and their side of things. So if we are talking about giving justice, it shouldn't be about stating the law. It should also be about what the victim has been has gone through, and necessarily listening to her side of things. And in terms of justice, what is that she expects? So it's not just, obviously she expects punishment for the perpetrator, and that's something that the law has been doing. But beyond that, when she goes back to the society after the case is done, she still has to live in that society, and she still has to go through a lot, many problems, and most of them would be psychological, and most of them has to do with her mental capability, and how that, obviously because of the trauma that she's been through, has deteriorated to a certain extent, and is she able to bring herself back. So speaking about what has happened to her, but also acknowledging that it wasn't her fault. Society could, if she was in a position, if she was doing in a profession or a job, giving her that job back, allowing her to come back to work, uh, and not questioning her character. These could be some of the things that could be a starting point. So we should also keep this in mind, and should always keep this in mind, that it's an offense that has happened to the victim. It's not the victim's fault that it happened to her. She wasn't. It's not because where she was, or at what time she was, or what she was wearing, or who she was talking to, or whether she was at a party, or whether she was drunk, or all of that. It's entirely the fault of the perpetrator. It's not because the victim did something, or she was responsible for perhaps that offense to have happened to her. So it's not that way. And the moment we let go of this line of thinking, I guess it becomes easier for the victim to take care of herself after the legal procedures have ended, when she goes back to society. So in some ways, and that also will give a message that, yes, if something like this does happen, uh, obviously there is law, and people do get justice. But post that, there is also this support system in the society that helps the victim rebuild her life back again. So I mean, this could be something to start, but there could be other things as well, that people working in the field could think about, and actually ask the authorities to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amit. With this, I would like to conclude the session. Thank you, everyone, for sparing some time and joining us for a wonderful session. And thank you, Dr. Amit, for just throwing such, highlighting those issues and having a wonderful session on theorizing gender and violence. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Can we end this? Hello.